Good morning, everybody. Thank you. We have a modest turnout this morning, but not bad for a Friday on the edge of the campus. And thank you all for making the trek over here. My pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. And to set a little context, you all know the shorthand that we've moved from the first nuclear age to the second nuclear age. Although we never called it the first nuclear age while it was the first nuclear age. It's a label we've given back to it ex post facto. But along the way, we've moved from a bipolar nuclear environment through a somewhat unipolar environment into a multipolar environment. And in this environment, there are a variety of new actors competing in the nuclear realm. This is especially so in South Asia, but of course not exclusively. We put a lot of our attention on Northeast Asia these days. Seem to have forgotten, for the moment at least, the dynamics of nuclear competition that might yet emerge in the Middle East. And we have certainly not spent much time in the last couple of years, at least from a national policy perspective, thinking about the problems of nuclear stability in South Asia. But that's part of what we're here to talk about today. Those instabilities, of course, in the first nuclear age were defined as crisis instability and arms race instability. We see both of those at play in South Asia. But Dr. Yusuf's book is focused very much on the question of crisis instability in South Asia and the unique dynamics of the kinds of crises that might unfold between regional actors in which the outside major powers come in to try to deal with the instabilities and deal with the mounting crisis. And in South Asia, of course, we see both India and Pakistan moving to adopt strategies that would not only reinforce the usual incentive to go first in time of a mounting crisis and war, but to go very early in the hope of escaping the tender mercies of the United States and any other outside powers that might try to jump in to prevent things from escalating. And this adds a significant new dimension of instability to the landscape. Dr. Yusuf is the author of a new book from Stanford University Press, just out, right?
Actually, not out.
Not out. That bears a striking resemblance to being a copy, but it looks very good. Well done.
I literally did.
Dr. Yusuf is associated with the United States Institute for Peace. He joined the institute in, as I understand it, 2010, and where he directs the Institute's Asia Center. He was previously affiliated as a research center with both the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. And he was affiliated also as a teaching fellow with both Boston University, where he received his master's and doctorate, as well as a university in Pakistan, and I won't do the disservice of butchering the name of the university in Pakistan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yusuf this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Thanks, Zach, and thanks to all of you for joining. So the book is actually technically not out. I wasn't lying, and I did actually steal it from the ISA conference last week because I didn't have a copy, so didn't know how to show off otherwise. What I thought I'd do, and how long would be?
30 to 40 minutes or so.
Yeah, I'd shut up before that.
Q&A for...
Usually people can't tolerate me for that long, so I'll try and keep it short. So what I thought I was going to do here is talk through the basic logic for the model that I present in the book, and then touch upon South Asia, but also how this may apply to other regions of the world. But let me just sort of give you a little bit of the background to sort of lay the groundwork. This book is specifically looking at regional nuclear rivals. second-age nuclear powers, sort of you mentioned. India, Pakistan are my principal case studies because I'm looking at crises, and thankfully since the end of the Cold War, no other countries have been crazy enough to test that. In fact, we don't have perfect regional dyads apart from South Asia. The closest ones then are China and India. And a future Iran, if it's nuclear, and Israel would be in that space, or if you could think about the Koreas getting nuclearized apart from the North. The three case studies that I would refer to, so I'll sort of put it out there for you, are the three major crises that India and Pakistan had since their overt nuclearization in 1998. They tested nuclear weapons in 98. Their first crisis was within a year of those tests, called the Kargil crisis, where essentially there was a military confrontation up in the mountains in the disputed territory of Kashmir. Pakistan made a clandestine incursion into Indian controlled territory, and essentially then there were about 75 days of quote-unquote war in which the Indians tried to and essentially succeeded in evicting the Pakistani intruders. The second crisis that I look at was the 10-month military standoff in 2001-2002, where essentially India and Pakistan had the largest military mobilization since 1971, which was sort of their major war. And Zach has actually done a whole book on this crisis in edited volume. Again, this was a full-scale Indian mobilization matched by the Pakistanis. If you read the reporting from the time, the multiple times, many, many days you would wake up and read the newspaper as if in the evening there was going to be a major war. Ultimately, there wasn't, and the de-escalation took place 10 months later. So I studied that one. And the third one, I think all of you would have heard about at least, or are somewhat familiar with, are the famous, infamous Mumbai attacks of 2008, where 150, 160 people were killed by multiple terrorist attacks by an organization known to be close to the Pakistani intelligence agency, the ISI, and again the debate continues on what that is. But at the end of the day, that crisis lasted for about 3 months. Tensions were high, but there was no war. I also then look at what happens post 2008, and the one blip there, not as I wouldn't define it as the kind of crisis that I've looked at, was an Indian surgical strike into Pakistani controlled territory of Kashmir, where the Indians claimed that they had gone in and attacked terrorists some kilometers into Pakistani territory and also killed a few Pakistani military officers. Pakistan essentially denied that ever happened, but that was another sort of period of a week or 10 days that happens. Later on at the end, I would also talk about how I think there is relevance of the model to the Korean situation, as I said, in Iran-Israel situation if Iran were nuclear, and then I look at China-India briefly. The other thing I wanted to mention is, and actually Feroz was mentioning this to me earlier, when I mention the word third party, I'm really talking about the US, but the third party in the model is a plural. It is US plus any other larger influential powers, and I will sort of differentiate that when I speak to it. But you could replace the US with another hegemon in another world and call it China or Russia, and the model would still hold. So with that preamble, let me just say what the book is about, or why I actually did what I did. Everything we know or have known for the most part about nuclear deterrence theory and nuclear crisis management comes from the Cold War essentially, and that's pretty natural. And the two tendencies you find in literature over and over again are, number one, a bilateral context is assumed as a given, and that again comes from the US-Soviet Union kind of conflict during the Cold War. But the third party is never seen as an endogenous actor that's changing crisis behavior in as much as brinkmanship models go and how we expect crises, nuclear crises, to play out. The second tendency that you'd find is that there is an attribution of strategic independence when you acquire nuclear weapons. So one of the ideas behind the argument that the power that nuclear weapons ascribe or attribute to a country, one of that is that you don't have to be as beholden to other pressures because now you are a nuclear power. When I started looking at South Asia and theoretically studying these second age quote-unquote nuclear rivalries, I found one thing very clearly, and I knew something was missing here, but I couldn't really figure out for a number of years till I did this what that was. And the something was that the third party was in the face. Everybody would talk about the US and the US doing this or that. India and Pakistan would deny that they ever got the US involved. The US would say, we don't have any role, this is a sovereign issue between the two countries. And yet everything you looked at, this third party was all over the place. So that's what I started unpacking, and what the book has ended up being is which I don't think exists before this, a theory of nuclear deterrence and specifically nuclear crisis management that focuses on third party mediation. And what I do here in this book is explain how we should study the process of nuclear crisis behavior in these regional contexts, different from what we've known as the brinkmanship model, and what new risks get induced into the equation because of these third parties that show up, and how does that change our understanding of what nuclear crises should be and how we should look at them. So this is, I don't need to explain this, but essentially the classic sort of Schelling brinkmanship idea, threats that leave something to chance. You have a competition in threat making. My resolve is greater than yours. You must blink and give in to what I want. And essentially the only thing that stops you is neither side wants nuclear war. So it's a competition in threat making, but you want to stay below the nuclear threshold, and all the risk comes in because who knows where the threshold is and what could go wrong and all of that. That's where you start off. And then what I do, and I don't necessarily want you to or need you to read the slide, but let me explain it in these terms. Brinkmanship bilaterally is a balancing act, as we know, between conveying resolve to the opponent, that I will take you down and punish you unless you listen to what I'm saying, and ensuring that you're prudent enough not to cross the red line or not to force the other side to panic into doing something preemptively. My model essentially says that in these regional contexts, you must include a parallel mechanism whereby these regional rivals, India and Pakistan, are simultaneously using this resolve and prudent behavior to signal to the US in this case, but say third party or the US primarily, to get the US to back their crisis objectives. So their behavior is the same action is aimed both at the opponent and also at the world, essentially, in two ways. You could be belligerent and provocative to signal to the third party, to the US and others, that unless you come and do what I'm asking you to do, I may actually go ahead and punish this opponent and things could go wrong. Or you could tell the third party or signal to the third party through action and pronouncements that I am actually the victim, I am willing to be measured, prudent and responsible, it's the other side that's aggressive, better go and make them behave or else things could go wrong. So the same threats that leave something to chance and I don't know what could happen is now simultaneously being projected at the opponent and the US or sort of the third party. The criteria for the third party in my model is stronger third parties that have influence and leverage by virtue of the power differential. Right? So the US is the obvious one in the time that I study, unipolar moment, global power, etc., leverage and influence. The big difference from the Cold War is that there was no third party that fit that definition, because the superpowers were essentially the dominant forces in that nuclear environment, and any time they worked with allies, used allies as proxies and fought proxy wars, there wasn't a nuclear angle to that in terms of the allies' possession of nuclear weapons. As the regional rivals, India and Pakistan, do this, the US, or the third party I would say, because this is the model, I haven't gotten to the empirics, the principal goal that gets them involved is de-escalation of the crisis. That's the principal priority, and I ascribe that to the importance of the nuclear moment. If you take away the nuclear weapons from this equation, you're in a qualitatively different space and different reactions could come. The third party comes in to mediate, to get de-escalation. But the interesting part here is, intuitively you could make an argument that just like the Cold War, where the US and the Soviet Union came and threatened essentially each other, that they would intervene militarily to support their ally. That was sort of the norm every time. in this case, you would expect that if the US is sort of the sole superpower, can come and tell these boys to behave, you would expect the US to bring all its sort of leverage points to bear. Could be diplomatic, could be economic, could be military threats if India or Pakistan are not behaving. I argue that in these environments, the third party's ability to credibly threaten military action is actually non-existent. I want to explain this point because this is counterintuitive to what we know from literature. If the US comes in and signals to India, for instance, that I am going to gang up with you to beat up on Pakistan, you have just forced Pakistan into a self-help mode which may actually cause them to consider some precipitous action, preemption, panic, whatever else there is. The point is that if the third party completely isolates one side and backs the other, it is inducing possibilities of escalation rather than increasing the probability of de-escalation. And thus I argue that what you will find third parties do, irrespective of their power differential, is really use economic and diplomatic inducement or punishment to force behavior change in the actions of the regional rivals. The final point I'll make here, and then I'll move on. As I said, I'm looking at the process of how this plays out. How do these three parties interact? What do they do? And what are the risks that are involved? The model is not dependent on the outcome. So what I'm arguing here is not that this interaction will always end up in a de-escalated crisis. What I'm arguing is that if you want to understand nuclear crisis behavior in these contexts, you must internalize the role of the third parties and then study this as a three-actor model rather than a two-actor model, and study what the processes are, what the incentives are, strategies are, expectations are. But the third party may fail to stop a war and a nuclear war. Things could still go wrong. That's where the risks come in. So I just want to be clear that this is really I'm studying the process and not always saying that you would end up in a successful outcome. So what do I find? The way this plays out as a crisis is that India and Pakistan constantly signal to both the opponent and the third party, and remember, they are not saying which signal is to whom. I mean, this is a deciphering act and we have to decide who they may be intending that for, and oftentimes they're intending it for everybody. What they do is try very hard to convince everybody that they are not beholden to the third party, they will make autonomous decisions, and they signal to the opponent, just like in any Cold War model, that if you don't do what I'm asking, I'm going to punish you, and then things may go wrong. At the same time, they are excessively sensitive to not isolating the third party in a way that it forces their hand to go and team up with the opponent. So they're signaling that I am not beholden to you unless you do what I want. In reality, they're in parallel very sensitive to ensuring that they are not completely ignoring third parties' preferences or asks or demands. Right? So that's the complicated dynamic here, in which there is a balancing act with the opponent, which happens in every nuclear crisis, and with the third party. And all of this is a calibration to make sure that the third party comes and supports me against my opponent. And both sides do this as, depending on the context that they're in. The third party's role is essentially to convince these two actors, India and Pakistan, that if you allow me to be the manager of the crisis diplomacy, you are more likely to get closer to your crisis objectives than you are without me. So essentially, all they are doing is trying to convince them to work through them, let them handle the crisis, and not go after each other. That's sort of the complicated dynamic that played out in virtually every crisis. Now, if you put meat on these bones, what you realize is that this is very confusing, because nobody's telling anybody why they're signaling what they're signaling, and yet all three actors have to decode every single move to decide what they may mean by X or Y. Two slides on essentially what all of this boils down to in terms of the conclusions, and then I can talk a little bit about how this applies to the risks. Probably the boldest statement I make in the book is that any time two regional nuclear rivals get into a crisis, you will see the model play out. I'm fairly deterministic on that, and thus I'm happy to be challenged, and I can at least try and make a case. Why do I say that? The reason the model kicks in is, number one, unlike what we know from literature, the third party, the US, shows up, gets involved in the crisis to try and de-escalate it, not because it is invited by these actors, but because it itself believes that the risk of nuclear war is greater than zero, and greater than zero is too great to let these two sides figure it out. So the third party actually shows up because it itself is worried about the presence of nuclear weapons, not the objective risk of nuclear war. Not that we know that something is about to be launched, but the fact that nuclear weapons exist actually drive that behavior of getting interested and involved in trying to figure out what the US can or cannot do. I found very interestingly, and I think this is a bit of the Cold War hangover and the risks that we lived through, but the nuclear angle actually creates a bypassing channel in Washington's bureaucracy in a way that the working level is just completely left out, and this goes right to the top. I mean, day one, the National Security Advisor is in and the President is in. And the only conversation they have for the first 24 hours invariably is this going to be a nuclear war or not? Even when, quite frankly, objectively speaking, there's literally no possibility. In the first crisis in Kargil in '99, we still are debating whether Pakistan could even operationalize or India could even operationalize a nuclear weapon. Yet, that was it wasn't the objective risk. It was the fact that nuclear weapons existed. And India and Pakistan will regularly complain that we exaggerate the risks. And I think they're right. We actually do. But that's not a choice. I think it's a psychological trigger in some ways, given the bureaucratic sort of history which brings this in. So one argument I make is that the US shows up of its own accord. On the regional rival side, there are two problems. These new regional rivals who have new nuclear weapon states who are regional rivals have no by-escalation control regimes in place. So they know how to fight. They don't know how to de-escalate a crisis. And in fact, Zach and Firoz and others have done a lot of work on this. In virtually every simulation you sit through, both of them swear in the beginning that they'll do everything but no nuclear war. And all of them end up in a nuclear war because of the momentum of the crisis if the third party is taken out. So that's one problem. And I argue that you can look at Iran, Israel tomorrow, North Korea, South Korea, North Korea, Japan, whatever, the ones we talk about, they will all be in a similar situation in the first initial decade or two of their rivalries. It's going to be very difficult to come up with some kind of robust bilateral escalation control, which means that that problem will remain. And the second problem for India and Pakistan and for these regional actors is that once you know the US is going to show up and want to get involved in crisis diplomacy, your choice is either to basically refuse that role, which means you strengthen the hand of the opponent who's going to use this third party against you, or to play ball. And as soon as you get involved in the communication, you have the model play out. So the argument I'm making here is that it is not it's a choice of course, but it is not a choice in a way that there is no cost for these regional rivals to say, I can actually do this on my own. The costs are always higher than getting involved in this crisis diplomacy as long as the third party shows up. And I argue that the third party shows up because of its own problem. So in the regional context, and again, we can have a conversation, I think this model holds every time you get into that crisis. Whether it succeeds or not is another question in terms of the outcomes. I've already spoken to this tension between the regional rivals wanting to show autonomy and being deferral to the third party. But this slide is important because at three levels it challenges what we've known of nuclear crisis behavior so far. The first bullet is, of course, it's an eager entrant. The second one is that I find that the US every time enters with the primary objective of de-escalating the crisis. And in as much as broader US foreign policy objectives complement that de-escalation goal in that crisis moment, they work with that. As soon as there is a determination that the larger national security objective, regional objective, broader foreign policy at the time is going to contradict the de-escalation goal, it's going to make it harder to de-escalate the crisis, the broader interests are suspended in time till the crisis de-escalates. It's actually to me this was very puzzling on why this would happen. And again, it's that nuclear moment that isolates the conversation from that larger piece. So I'll give you an empirical example which I found very interesting. People challenged me when I was doing this, I mean in academic settings, to sort of make me think on, but this was all about Afghanistan. Two of your main cases happened after 9/11. The US was invested in Afghanistan. The crises were happening next door. If there was no Afghanistan, the US probably wouldn't show up. So I started investigating that through my interviews and through whatever records I could see. And the interesting thing I found was that what happens in the bureaucracy is that there's a bifurcation. The US embassies in Islamabad and Delhi, the working level of the State Department, Pentagon, White House, etc., all remained fixated on the equities in Afghanistan. What would happen if this happened? How do we do this and that? The principals who were making the decision completely blocked out that conversation in all the crisis conversations. In fact, in 2008, the Mumbai crisis, the National Security Council was bifurcated between the office that looked after, oddly enough, Iraq and Afghanistan, and then the ones that looked after India, Pakistan, and South Asia. And the ones that looked after Iraq and Afghanistan were not invited to any crisis meeting that happened during the Mumbai crisis. So, it's a very conscious decision, and I talked to people who were involved, including sort of the National Security Advisor at the time, etc., and they confirmed that this was a very conscious decision precisely because they didn't want the Afghanistan equities to sort of overshadow the goal of getting rid of the escalatory pattern that may have existed at the time. The second interesting fact is that contrary to the Cold War, I find no evidence of competitive third-party involvement. The US collaborates very, very closely with the UK and the Europeans to the point of deciding which official from which country would show up which day to do what. But the interesting part is that even the Chinese and the Russians and others very quickly fall in line, even if there's no collaboration in the sense of everyday conversations, fall in line with the overall de-escalation agenda. So they are very careful not to undercut any effort being made by the US to de-escalate the crisis. So rather than using these regional actors as proxies for their great power competition, in that moment in time, China essentially suspends its overtly pro-Pakistan stance in terms of India-Pakistan. The US, to a large extent, suspended its pro-India stance in sort of recent years to get to de-escalation. And as soon as the crisis is de-escalated, you very quickly go back to the foreign policy objective and the agenda, and you see contradictory kind of messages coming out. So what that means is that this crisis moment is a very tactical intervention to get to that objective of de-escalation. And that brings me to the final bullet on this page, which is that the third party is deliberately manipulative of the information and of the role that it plays in the crisis. So you'll find a lot of conversation about the importance of impartiality and neutrality of an external actor. When it comes into this situation, if they're not perceived as impartial or neutral, the countries may not actually believe them, and thus things may not work out. I find that actually impartiality and neutrality are not nearly as important as the belief in India and Pakistan's minds that the US has leverage and influence over their opponent. As long as they believed if the US wanted to, it could get Pakistan or India to do X or Y, they are willing to actually engage with the US. There was not a moment in the 10 years that I studied where India and Pakistan trusted the US or thought of the US as neutral. Both thought that the US was in the other's bag. And yet they operated under the assumption and the belief that the US has leverage and it actually can change behavior on the other side. And of course, the goal was don't let the US impose leverage on me, but get the other side to do what we want through the US. The US, interestingly, because the goal was de-escalation, very carefully and deliberately chose information, selected information, decided what intelligence to share, at what point, with whom, how, no. So almost, I was quite impressed how, without any real sort of structure around it, I mean, there's no institutional memory of this in the US government. The crisis is over and then the next one, new people come in and have to figure it out. And there's so something structural in the model that forces a conversation in a direction, and again, I attribute that to the stakes that people feel are present in this sort of regional nuclear context. So in any case, I pick up a number of examples and report in the book where the US shared full information, the US tilted towards one side versus the other, India or Pakistan. The US did not share very important information, sometimes almost borderline made up information. All of that with one goal. What is the most assured way to get to de-escalation? And even the communication with the other third parties, the Chinese and UK, it was all based on this premise. What should we get somebody to do to get de-escalation? I mean, involving the Saudis and this and that in various crises. So that's essentially how these crises played out as I saw them. What are the risks? Because that's fundamentally the policy question boils down to this. What do you want me to do as the policymaker? The first thing I would put out is that for those of you familiar with the literature, this debate about nuclear deterrence, optimism and pessimism, right? I mean, there's one argument that no, nuclear deterrence holds no matter what. And there are the others who say, well, actually, no, there are tons of risks that you haven't looked at. It's just good fortune that things don't blow up. And my argument here is that on top of the risks that everybody talks about already, there is a whole layer of new risks induced because of this three parties engagement that I've looked at. And we need to mainstream those in our thinking to understand what these nuclear crises would be. The first thing is the incentive to create crises is greater. Because if you are India or Pakistan and you feel that if I get the US to come in and be attracted to a crisis to get involved, I can benefit from it, you are more likely to create that crisis. It's a classic moral hazard problem. The US will show up every time, so I can actually game that to get a benefit out of it. If I'm India today and I know that Pakistan is in the dock, perfect moment to have a crisis and get the US to come and back me. So the incentive there is high. I asked US officials, do you not realize that this moral hazard problem is serious? If they know you're going to show up every time and you are going to show up every time, you're actually creating an incentive. And the answer was, we actually know that. But if you are asking me that my choice is go in, create the moral hazard, or stay out to undercut the moral hazard, I'm going in every time. I don't care. This is too important. Second, which we don't look at in the bilateral context as much because you don't need it, all of you know that one of the things we sort of beat up so much and put in everybody's head during the Cold War as a confidence building measure or as a risk reduction measure was direct communication. Everything somehow boiled around hotlines, risk reduction centers, blah, blah, blah. Guess what? By definition, you don't have anything direct here because you've got multiple parties engaging at the same time. India, Pakistan, US, China, Saudi Arabia, UK, blah, blah, blah. So you've got a classic multiple audience problem, right? I am India signaling, I mean, I give you empirical examples. In Kargil, India believed that the US either has leverage over Pakistan and has decided not to push Pakistan to get their troops out of Indian territory, or it has failed to exercise leverage and the Pakistanis are continuing to beat us up on the battlefield. And so they came very close to taking unilateral action to expand the crisis with this perception that the US has failed or is not interested, is really siding with with Pakistan. Both of them were wrong because the US actually did succeed, but it came very close. In 2001-2002, the crisis was triggered by a terrorist attack on the Indian Parliament 2 months after 9/11, essentially. And the Indians mobilized within 3 or 4 days, a full-scale mobilization, under the pretext that in the new post-9/11 environment, the US has no way but to side with us and allow us to punish Pakistan. In that mindset, so we can get away with more than less. Again, turned out to be false. I report that in the Kargil crisis, there's this famous episode where the CIA picked up intelligence that Pakistan was moving nuclear missiles. There were movements around nuclear storage sites and missiles. And it was interpreted as saying that they are actually preparing something for an eventuality. I'm as confident as it gets that that is not true. But in any case, that happened. So what I actually look at is, this was used by President Bill Clinton to scare the Pakistani Prime Minister into getting him to back off and back down. But the US did not share this information with the Indians. In a scenario where it reported to the Indians that the Pakistanis are mobilizing to do something, imagine what the other side would have done and where this would have gone. The point I'm making is that the possibility of misinterpreting here with multiple players involved is much greater than in a normal sort of bilateral context, and we've got to unpack that and study that. Imagine a crisis today. And imagine a scenario in which the US and China have to coordinate on a crisis strategy to de-escalate in the midst of trade wars. How difficult that would be given the situation. So there are various sort of machinations of this, but that's where it is. The other interesting point is, the response I get is, yeah, that's why they need to have hotlines, and they need to talk directly. Well, in every single crisis, they had hotlines. Except Kargil, no, but they had other channels they used. The first thing India and Pakistan stop doing or misuse are hotlines, because they don't trust each other, right? The other problem is, the third party here has very little interest in allowing these two sides to only talk directly. Because the number one control mechanism in a crisis that the third party has is to become an information conduit, right? If you pull yourself out, how do you have leverage? And so there's a perverse incentive here which doesn't allow you to get to the answers that all policymakers give, hotlines and risk reduction. I'm not saying not do that, and my argument is not that. But I think we need to think much more deeply about how this would play out in this environment. And the final point in the risks I'll make, and I picked this up in every single attempt, not only in South Asia but even the Koreas. The crisis, because the intervention is tactical, peacetime is completely separate. And in peacetime, India and Pakistan acquire new defense equipment, posture differently, create new doctrines, blah, blah, based on their experience of the previous crisis. Right? So the Indians came out of the 2001-2002 crisis seething with discontent and concluding that the reason they couldn't attack Pakistan was that their military mobilization times are 3 to 4 weeks, the lines of communication are too long, and Pakistan has shorter lines of communication, can mobilize very quickly. And so we have to change our military doctrine in terms of mobilizing vis-a-vis Pakistan, and they came up with something called cold start, which essentially says two things. I'm going to mobilize quickly and punish Pakistan, short of crossing their red line, and I'm going to do it so quickly that these Americans can't come and tell me to back off before I punish Pakistan. So explicitly undermining the model, right? I'm not going to let the third party come in. The Pakistanis responded, okay, so we are now going to develop a tactical nuclear weapon which is going to plug that limited war gap, because if you do this, I'm going to nuke you. Forget about whether it's bizarre or not, I mean that's a separate debate, right? But both of them are saying one thing, I'm going to keep this third party out. So the model is challenged. Then I unpack that, and what I recognize is that actually neither is saying that. What the Indians are saying is, I want to punish Pakistan, and then I want the third party to come in and tell the Pakistanis not to respond to my action, because I have no bilateral mechanism of preventing that from happening. The Pakistanis are telling the Americans, either you come in at 0 before the first shot is fired by the Indians, or you come after I have responded to the Indians. So it's really a calibration of timing when they want the third party to show up. What you don't realize is that you're actually making crisis management much tougher in this environment. So after every crisis, what you find is these countries, the way they posture, the way they apply their next crisis model, makes a crisis more likely, but management more difficult. Right? So peacetime, and I would argue the third parties actually facilitate that. Arms exports, not really being bothered with much of what is happening because of larger foreign policy interests, blah, blah, blah. And the future of South Asia to me is, and this is, a lot of you come from the scientific background, technology acquisition is pushing South Asia in a very familiar modernization territory. MIRVing, cruise missiles, BMDs, triads, tactical nukes, perhaps deployment and launch on warning tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. Everything that we've seen before 50 years ago. Which means that the time between a crisis trigger and the ability to use a nuclear weapon is down to near 0, which means that the risks of things going wrong are higher, which also means that the third party is even more worried that something is going to go wrong and thus wants to get involved. And so it will get involved, there will be a 3-player game, but the probability of the third party being able to influence de-escalation will be much lower given where these countries are headed. So the future is actually more dangerous, more crises, less likely to be managed, and yet more incentive to attempt to hold it back. Final slide. If you were to ask me what is the one-line plea in the book, that is to get out of the fixation of trying to impose what we know from nuclear deterrence literature on these new rivalries in crises, and acknowledge the centrality of this, whatever the third party is, and start studying what that does to crises and risks and how we can sort of mitigate them. Because the answers are very different. As I explained to you, hotline ain't going to cut it. But think about other things and get to that. Second, I'll skip the second bullet, but the second thing I would put out to you is the 2 conclusions that I drew, which are sort of for the broader non-South Asia world. Number 1, and I'm not arguing that this model seamlessly transfers into an Iran, Israel, etc. But the other kind of cases that we talk about, Iran, Israel, North Korea, etc., there is a clear adversary and a clear partner or ally for the US. Unlike in South Asia where you could argue both were somewhat friends. So what happens there? And what I look at and argue is that the situation gets much more complicated because no one third party has leverage over both actors. Imagine a nuclear Iran and a nuclear Israel. Who is going to play the third party role vis-a-vis Iran? It's not the US. So what you end up there is really necessitating various third parties to collaborate and coordinate to ensure de-escalation, which means that the importance of US, China, US, Russia, whatever, coordination in those moments is much greater. Of course, North Korea is not the example of a regional nuclear rivalry right now, but even if you look at what happened in the past 3 months before this summit conversation in the Koreas, the US, interestingly, was playing 2 roles all the time. It was the defender of the South Koreans and the Japanese in the eventuality of a war, so all the Trump signals and everything. Simultaneously, it was the global leader working with China to ensure that the red line wasn't crossed, the bluff and bluster aside. So the entire conversation with the Chinese was essentially to make sure that the North Koreans behaved themselves and this did not go overboard. It would be very similar in an Iran-Israel kind of scenario, where you would have to use other third parties to make that happen. Then that depends on what the relationship is with the third parties and how well that can be done, etc. The final point and twist on this is that we have a larger alliance credibility problem because of this. if the US has to play a dual role in any nuclear environment because it does not want the next nuclear war under its watch, but it also has to back its ally, so take Iran, Israel again, the Israelis would expect 100% support from the Americans. The Americans also, our sort of bureaucratic impulse would be to support Israel against the adversary called Iran. Till the point that the question will come up on, do you embolden Israel to the point that you risk the next nuclear war based on that behavior? Or do you push Iran into panic mode by signaling that I am actually coming after you, and thus again create that potential escalatory ladder? And if not, then again you get into this trap of playing the dual role, which is, yes, I'm going to take you down if you do something to my ally, but the Chinese and the Russians, can you please go and tell Iran not to bring it to that point? We really need to make this work, right? We don't want another nuclear war. So if you play this out, 5 crises down, the South Koreas, the Japans, and the Israels of the world are picking up that the US has a conundrum. And that conundrum makes it less secure as an ally in terms of the security umbrella than more, because it's not going to be able to go out and support 100%. So down the line, there are non-proliferation concerns that can come in here. And that's the conversation the Japanese and South Koreans have in some ways right now. How credible are you? Are you going to fight I mean, this is the Cold War, right? Will you fight a war for Europe? That literature actually post-Cold War used to say, if you look at the literature from 90 to 93, 94, it's a unipolar moment. The US no longer has to show up to every crisis. There's no Soviet Union, no worry about a rival superpower, so it can pick and choose. Wherever it feels important, stakes are there, it'll go, otherwise no. I argue that actually because the nuclear issue, that option is gone. The US will show up every time. The reason it won't be able to back its allies fully is this problem of nuclear war, emboldening the ally versus preventing escalation. And so that, I think, needs to unpack more, but I see that as a growing problem, even in India-Pakistan, quite frankly. As the US-India relationship is growing and Pakistan-US is breaking, the Indians will very categorically say that the real test of the US partnership is going to be the next crisis with Pakistan. Are you going to back us or not? And the answer is probably not. And then what does that do to the partnership, etc. Let me stop here.